Alright, hello, welcome back to my C tutorial. Um, this is episode 2, where I'm going to go over just exactly what code we wrote in our first episode where we just got everything set up and got the project working. I've switched to my main system, which you might have noticed. I was on like a vanilla Linux slash Windows system before, so I hope you don't mind that. The code has stayed the same, it's just I'm doing it on my personal development environment now, which means occasionally I might hover stuff and you might see interesting things, but don't worry about that too much. It's just information that I like to have available. Anyway, let's go over what exactly this code does, because there's quite a lot going on here, right? I mean, you have a hash symbol here, you have some angle brackets, you have parentheses, braces, you have all the kinds of brackets besides square brackets, and just a whole bunch of random words, it seems. So let's go over the first most essential point about C programs. So when the computer runs your C program, what it's going to do is it's going to look for a function. And this is a function here, it's called main. And in fact, the C um, compiler is going to look for this function specifically called main. It can take no arguments, or it will, as we'll see later, it can take some arguments, but those arguments are required to be of a certain form. And the return type of main, which is what this int is doing here, has to be int. What this means is that whenever we exit main, we give back to whoever called us an integer. So that's just, from math, an integer. And as you can see at the very bottom of main, we actually do return an integer. That integer is 0. And what 0 means is that the program ran okay. If you return anything other than 0 from main, the OS is going to just display some kind of error message maybe, or maybe it'll just do nothing. It doesn't have to do anything, but it's useful as like an error code of sorts. And so these curly braces here denote the beginning and the end of the function main. So let's go over the notation again. So we start with the return type, which is int, or integer for short, or you know what I mean. You have the name of the function, which is main in this case. You have some parentheses, and inside these parentheses you can put parameters that the function will be required to be called with. But for our beginner tutorial, we're going to just put nothing inside these parentheses. And again, I'm going to go over function parameters in a much later tutorial whenever we start going over how to create your own functions besides main. Um, the process is very similar, but it's kind of considered an advanced topic because it starts breaking your code up into chunks and it's hard to tell how the computer exactly is going to execute your code. Then we have these curly braces, which denote the boundaries of the function, basically. Anything inside these curly braces is part of the function called main, which returns an int. So let's talk about what's actually inside these braces, right? We have this return statement, which we already went over. It just tells the caller that the program ran okay, if you want to put it in like English terms. And then we have this thing called puts, and we put more parentheses after this, and we put in double quotes "Hello World." So what on earth is this doing? Um, Now puts is actually a function, as you can see my VS Code telling me. So puts is a function declared somewhere else in the world. And what we can do is we can call functions in C. And in order to call them, we just use the exact same notation as they were created with, which is the parentheses. And we pass in whatever values that function needs. So puts happens to be a function that takes only one value. And that value is called a const char star underscore underscore s, which is very strange notation, and we'll go over what the heck that means later. But what you should know is that you can pass in what is called a string literal to puts. It happens to be this type here. It's the same type. Um, and what you do to denote a string in C is you put double quotes around it. So what we're doing is we are calling the function called puts, and we are giving it the value hello world. And that's pretty much it. And what puts is going to do with that value is it's going to put it on the screen. I usually think of this as put string. That's what I think that stands for. Maybe you could think of it as a function that puts whatever you give it on the screen, you know? But that's not super important. What is super important is this semicolon at the end. And on every line in C, you're going to want a semicolon at the end. There are some exceptions, which if you put semicolons at the end of those, it will actually cause some very strange errors, and we'll go over those and how to avoid them. For example, if you put a semicolon here, you're going to get an error on the next line, which is a very confusing error, right? But what you have to know is that semicolons don't go after this, and so we just put it like that with no semicolon here, no here, not here, but on these two lines. These are called statements in C because they do something, right? This is a return statement because it returns from the function to its caller. This is I'm not sure what kind of statement this is exactly, but it is a function call statement. And what it does is it puts hello world on the screen. If you want to just read it in English, that's what it does. And finally, we have the very first line of the program, which I somehow haven't covered until now. This is called an include directive. This is not a statement, and it's not a declaration, which is what main is. Main is a function declaration. So that's the three kinds of lines of C code. You have statements, you have declarations, which is this entire function here. So declarations can contain statements. That's important, at least sometimes. And you have directives. Now, what directives are is they tell the compiler to do something. And what the compiler is going to do is it's going to read this and it's going to figure out what it needs to do. So it says include, and then we put in angle brackets stdio.h. Now, stdio.h is actually a file on your computer. You can open it. It looks a bit ridiculous and impossible to read, so don't bother like trying to read that and figure out what it's doing. But so I'll just tell you what it's doing. Basically, it's declaring a bunch of functions like main, but not called main. For example, puts. Puts is one of those functions declared inside stdio.h. And so what this directive says is we just want the contents of stdio.h to be part of this program so that we can refer to functions that it declares. If any of that terminology is confusing, please let me know in the comments. I've been coding for a very long time, and this stuff is just kind of jargon that you learn, but and a lot of the jargon comes from the fact that there are three kinds of lines of code, right? You have declarations, you have statements, and you have directives. Um, but I explained that jargon at least, so hopefully the amount of confusion here is pretty minimal at this point. I mean, there's not very much going on. All we do is we put hello world on the screen and then we say that the program exited successfully. If you've ever used Python, this is similar to an import statement in Python, although um, a lot more subtle in terms of what it actually does. Because, for example, we don't say from stdio.h import puts. You don't say that. Instead, it just kind of implicitly gives you access to puts. And in fact, if we were to remove this, this is an important fact. If you remove that include directive, puts is actually just going to say this thing. This is what's called a warning, and this is not going to fail the compilation. It's still going to compile, so I'll go ahead and compile it here. And you can see that it's telling me, hey, you need this include line, but it's still going to compile. It's just a warning. I'm going to recommend that we always follow those warnings though. So let's go ahead and put this back. That was just a demonstration. But it kind of shows what stdio.h is actually doing, right? It's just declaring functions that exist, and we can call them whether or not we know they exist. If you as the programmer know that puts exists, you can just call it whenever you want and it will work. But it's much nicer to include stdio.h so that you know like what kind of arguments it takes, what it returns maybe. It returns an int here, for example. We're just actually throwing that on the garbage. We don't care what puts returns. Maybe we should care what puts returns, and I'll go over how to figure out like what it returns in what conditions and etc. in a future tutorial. But that's about it for this Hello World program. It's very simple. Um, if you wanted to print something other than Hello World, you could of course put whatever words you want inside this string. It doesn't have to be Hello World. Um, but yeah, that kind of covers the very basic components of a C program. You have your include directives, which typically go at the top of the file. you have your function declaration for main, and you have statements inside of main that do something. And that's about it. So I'll see you in the third tutorial where we're going to go over doing something a little bit more interesting than putting a constant string on the screen. All right, I will see you then.